WCLN 1170 Radio and Cable Channel 16 are pleased to present We Should Know, hosted by J.W. Simmons, an upbeat, informative look at people, places, and issues facing our community. This education-based analysis of issues will remain positive and informative as we consider closely what we should know.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I want to thank you for being with us today. We Should Know is on the air. I'm J.W. Simmons. It's always great to be with you and see you every week. We're talking about subjects each week on this show that's not only information, but hopefully education for you. Certainly is for us. We have been very fortunate over the years to have some outstanding guests to come in and speak to us today. We're kind of moving to a new land of technology to try to get some folks in here to help us understand and give us a better in-depth perspective of what's going on. And that person today is somebody that I'm very excited to have on. It's Dr. Blake Brown with North Carolina State University. He happens to be a Hugh C. Kiger Professor of Agriculture, which is a huge deal at North Carolina State. There's a lot of distinguished things that goes along with that title. He's just returned from he's just returned to North Carolina State University on assignment as senior economic person for the Council of Economic Advisors, the Executive Office of the President, where he focused on agricultural policy. Dr. Brown, I want to touch on that for a moment. Also want to mention that you do hold a PhD in economics from North Carolina State University, as well as a Master's of Science Agriculture from Economics in North Carolina State University, and also Bachelor of Science in Animal Science. Your life's experience, career-wise, has been built strongly around the whole arena and area of agriculture, and you've been not only classroom, but as I mentioned, just returning from an assignment in Washington, you've really had some very kind of groundbreaking experience in some of the things you've been involved in. And we're so fortunate that you'll take time to speak to the folks here. This, I like to say, is kind of in the epicenter of ag in North Carolina.
It is absolutely the epicenter of ag in North Carolina. I've always done a lot of work in eastern North Carolina and Sampson County, and that whole area is just one of the most intense agricultural areas in the whole United States, frankly. So thank you for having me. So,
absolutely. And I want to kind of open, I guess, with this idea of agriculture, COVID-19. We've hit the point in this journey, if we look at it as a journey, I guess, in which we're now looking at and talking about recovery. When you look at ag, what does recovery look like, and how many shapes do you see, particularly from the very focused background you have as an economist? It brings to mind a lot of questions that I know people have. What will that look like? And at the end of the day, our financial assets and resources is being stretched and challenged.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there's so many unknowns about how this is going to unfold. You know, what we all hope is we could have what they call a V-shaped recovery. Basically, you know, when we start lifting these quarantines and start, you know, easing the restrictions and going back to work, that the virus does not resurge, that we're able to get back to work quickly. If that's the case, you know, we'll have minimal damage to the economy, and we'll probably see the economy come back very quickly. The middle scenario, though, is one where, you know, we see some resurgence. We have to be very disciplined in coming back. We might have to pull back and shut things down just a little bit, you know, and then come back again. But, you know, that's sort of a middle scenario where we see the economy coming slowly back. We're obviously going to have some damage if that's the case. And then the worst case scenario, which we really hope does not happen, is that the virus resurges and we have to clamp things down, closed again. Hopefully that's not the case. What people around the world are looking at now, they're looking at China to see how they are able to come back after the COVID virus that they had back in February and had to shut things down completely. South Korea is trying to bring things back now. It seems like it's going pretty well in both of those countries, that we're not seeing huge resurgence of the virus. But we also know there's some places like Singapore, which of course is a large city state, where they have had problems with resurgence. So It really is I heard someone say this is not a matter of politics or anything else. It's really a scientific question. And that's true. It really depends on, how the virus acts when we start coming back. So hopefully that best case scenario will be is that we don't see it resurge right away and we come back quickly, but we don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
And I think that's one of the things, Dr. Brown, that we hear a lot, as you just mentioned on TV. We hear it a lot from the medical community talking about everything from another hump or slope coming back. We hear stuff like, well, we hope that maybe it's kind of a V shape where we come back and just zoom back up with the markets and everything is going great. So what I hear you saying is when we look at that physical side where people are getting sick, they're continuing to get sick, or they start to look like they're getting well, that also equates a bit to the ag side as we look at recovery.
It does. And, for North Carolina in particular, we're the second largest hog producing state in the nation and the second largest poultry producing state in the nation. So we have a lot of chickens and we have a lot of hogs and turkeys. And so the bottleneck there are the processing centers. And that's a difficult place because, workers work so closely together. So key for North Carolina agriculture, a big part of that's going to be how well these processing plants are able to navigate this virus and to bring those workers back in and make sure they continue. In fact, we haven't shut down a hog plant yet in North Carolina, making sure they don't have to shut down because of the COVID resurgence. So that's a big part of it. We've seen some poultry plants that have had to close temporarily in North Carolina. Hopefully we won't see that as we bring that about, that won't get worse. That's the big question for us, though.
Absolutely. And I think one of the areas, or some of the areas really that you just mentioned, are already heavily impacted. And when I talk to growers, actually the hog farmers, I talk to a lot of those folks, and the concerns they have is paramount kind of to looking at it from an economic perspective, because if the number of hogs they're able to raise is cut literally a third or more, that affects the amount of money that they receive, not only to pay the bills, but to help pay the loan off of the money they borrowed to build these, in some cases, multi-million-dollar facilities. Is really creating a lot of anxiety in the community of our ag growers. Is there a window of hope there, especially since the president has decided to make sure that the processing plants remain open? We're still hearing there may be as much as a 20 to 30% reduction in processing.
Well, I don't have as much information about what the integrated hog companies are doing in North Carolina. I do know that some of the poultry integrators have tried to slow down the production process. And one way they do that is by just not sending as many chicks out and maybe holding a little bit longer time between the batches that go through the houses. You can see the same thing in hogs. I don't know whether they've done that yet or not, but excuse me, as if you can imagine the management at one of these very large companies like Smithfield or Tyson or something like that, the difficulty in the decisions they make, because on the one end, there's lots of demand for meat. I mean, the public wants meat. At the other end, they don't want to have so many chickens going ready to go to slaughter, or so many hogs ready to go to slaughter, and then all of a sudden they have to close a plant, because you have a little window of time where you could hold those hogs back. Chickens, you have hardly any window of time at all that you can do that. So their decisions are very difficult. And I think probably, if they're like the poultry companies, the hog companies are also looking what they could do to have a contingency plan to slow that production down a little bit, so that should they have to close a plant, they're not got hogs just coming out the wazoo. That's the difficult decisions they have. So.
Well, it seems that one of the things that we have done with agriculture, and again, you've looked at this for a lot of years, but agriculture, particularly as it relates to growers and the farmers out there, have not only been productive, but with the help and support of places like North Carolina State University, have been able to apply science and become extremely productive in the products and commodities they produce. So to some degree, it's not and never has been a huge supply side thing. The product's always been there, but now we've reached the point in what you're discussing, we're trying to get people to kind of see here is that huge ability to produce and move product is now a disadvantage because there's not that much demand.
Well, actually, there's lots of demand at the consumer level, and there's lots of export demand for our hogs and chickens. It's just that bottleneck of processing that we have to make sure that continues to work correctly, because we can process in North Carolina about 45,000 hogs a day, believe it or not. That's the capacity we have, and that's huge. That's a bigger percentage of the national processing than we have of production, because a lot of hogs come from out of state to be processed here as well. So
we've got a lot of things we want to talk about. I want to kind of step into that world of exports just a little bit when we come back from break. But I know you did a lot of work with the tobacco and that particular row crop, not only in the sense of the export side, but also you work very aggressively in a lot of the kind of market analysis. And I'm looking at $9.6 billion tobacco buyout program that occurred. And I want to touch on that when we come back a little bit, because I have a lot of folks that tell me quite often, they'll say, well, I thought tobacco was pretty much gone. But I want to get your take on where we are with tobacco, and is that going to be a stable commodity going forward, and why is there still such a large demand for tobacco, given what we've gone through with the United States with the tobacco buyout program and a lot of the huge advertising that has kind of pushed people away because of the physical detriment of tobacco. So when we come back from break, I want to touch on that a bit and then get back into some of the other particulars related to agriculture and the recovery side and what that might look like from COVID-19. So ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. Call a friend. We're talking with Dr. Blake Brown, North Carolina State University. We'll be back in a moment.
Experiencing slow internet? If you have a fast internet package, the problem is most likely your wireless router. With more devices using Wi-Fi, your wireless router may not be able to deliver the speed and coverage you need. We now have the leading solution to enhance your internet experience. Using small devices in a mesh network, these Wi-Fi appliances cover just about any size home so that all your devices can operate to their fullest potential. Whole home Wi-Fi from Star Communications. Get the most out of your internet connection.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We should know it's on there. We're coming up on our second segment here. We're talking with Dr. Blake Brown. He's a Hugh C. Kiger Professor of Agriculture and Resource Economics at North Carolina State University. He has just returned from North Carolina State University from an assignment as Senior Economics for the Council of Economic Advisors in the Executive Office of the President, where he focused on agricultural policy. Dr. Brown, that's quite a statement to try to get in. I know when we went to break, we're going to talk about some other issues related to ag. But when you look out your window at the ag world, there's a lot of stuff going on in that environment.
There is. And, you know, what's kind of difficult this year is we were looking at a pretty strong agricultural outlook, strong economy and agriculture coming back this year before the COVID hit. You know, so if you had listened to my economic outlook presentation back the end of January, it was somewhat optimistic. In fact, I think I made the statement to Commissioner Troxler whenever we did that, you know, I thought this was going to be a strong year for poultry and hogs, and how quickly the world has changed in 2 months, you know, with COVID coming along and pretty much just sidelining that whole thing. And it's just a lot. Unfortunately, it has really made us a difficult year for us this year because of the pandemic. So.
And those processes, when we look at the bigger picture of ag, include a lot of other crop structures, field crops, and those kinds of things that have to be calculated in. We see a lot of what you just mentioned earlier when you talked about the livestock as it relates to hogs and chickens or swine and poultry, depending on what terminology you want to use here. that's a huge demand area for us. And if there is a area of anxiety, it builds around that. But there's also other crops in the area that have a potential for impact, and a lot of it has to do with exports.
It does. That's right. And we have such a diverse agriculture in North Carolina too. Now, people in Sampson County, for example, riding around, you see that diversity. But a lot of folks in North Carolina don't realize how diverse our agriculture is. So just to give them an illustration of that, I'll just share a slide with you real quickly so you can just kind of see that. And one of the things I like to do is educate people how diverse it is. You can see about 2/3 of our $11 billion ag receipts in North Carolina come from chickens and hogs and turkeys and eggs. But you can also see those other crops over there as well. And in fact, tobacco is only about 6% of our state's ag farm income now, but it's very important in some counties, in particular those I-95 corridor counties sort of centered around Wilson, which of course includes Sampson, Duplin, Johnston, all those counties. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea how diverse it is when we look at that. So,
one of the things that interests me with the tobacco piece itself is that when I look back at the historical side, tobacco in this country, on this continent, has always been somewhat of a huge dynamic. I mean, even when you look back historically at Jamestown and some of the other locations where folks from Europe came over, tobacco was probably one of the most meaningful pieces of wealth and growth.
That's right. It has been very important to our state's economy. It used to be over $1 billion in farm income just from tobacco. Now it's more like, well, unfortunately, last year, which is a pretty tough year in tobacco, was probably down around 500 million. But we've been producing around $600 or $700 million worth of tobacco every year. Believe it or not, North Carolina grows about 80% of the flue-cured tobacco grown in the United States. They used to be about 2/3 of it. And a lot of that tobacco is exported, as you talked about exports earlier. And a big export customer has been China. China started exporting or importing U.S. tobacco back around 2004 at the end of the tobacco program. And they had grown to about 14% of our tobacco market. About actually 30% of all exports of tobacco went to China. And then when the trade war came about in 2018, they completely stopped importing U.S. tobacco. And that was tough. That really put a dent in our farm economy in eastern North Carolina, because tobacco is still a very profitable crop most of the time. We were very hopeful that that was going to come back this year. We were hopeful that the Chinese were going to come in and buy some of the inventories that had been sitting there, and that maybe in 2021 we could see a boost in our tobacco production as a result of China coming back. The COVID has put some question marks there. I think they will be back. The question is COVID delaying that? And I know a lot of people in the industry are trying to work to get them to come back in this year, and they may come back and buy some inventories. We won't see an increase in farm production because of that in 2020, but maybe we could see a little increase in 2021 as a result of them coming back. And that's really important because, as I said, tobacco is still an important cash crop on a lot of these really diverse farming operations.
And I think one of the things you mentioned with the I-95 corridor, and particularly this part of the state, the soil type is just ideal for growing that crop as well.
That's right. U.S. tobacco is still seen as a premium product in the world market. It's a very small percentage of global tobacco production, but countries that want to improve the quality of their tobacco products will mix some U.S. tobacco with those to improve that quality. So it's some people have all used the term boutique tobacco. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's correct now, but the bottom line is that a lot of those people want some of this premium, high flavor, good quality tobacco to mix with other tobaccos around the world. So it's still important. It's not as important as it used to be. So
one of the kind of offshoots of that, and I know we didn't talk about this off air, but just want to kind of toss this out to see if it's something that you've seen or looked at or had any conversation with. Some time ago, we did a couple of shows dealing with the interest, should I say, in cannabis and the return of cannabis, particularly as it relates to a lot of the products that often folks didn't see cannabis as being part of, to include insulation and vehicles and various other things. Is that something you've seen on your radar anywhere as having any toehold to get back in process or to move back into the fields and take over some of those areas that have predominantly been held by tobacco and other crops?
I think so. I think particularly for flue-cured tobacco producers, as we see this market go forward, there's still a lot of unknowns there. The end products that the consumer takes are still fairly ill-defined. I mean, we see CBD oil, and we're now seeing more products come out of that. So we'll have to see how that consumer market continues to develop. One of the industries that's very interested in this, and has been fairly successful in moving forward, is the tobacco industry. And they have a lot of interest in cannabis products because they know how to control the retail space for a highly regulated product. They know how to process leaf crops. So a lot of the things that give us an advantage for growing tobacco in North Carolina also give us an advantage for growing a crop like cannabis. And I think it's going to be a little bit of a tough market as we get all this sorted out. There's going to be a lot of consolidation as the regulations emerge, as FDA probably starts regulating it in the next few years. And as that happens, some of the small players are going to fall out. And we're probably going to see players like the tobacco industry come in to the processing, the product development, and the marketing of it. And if that's the case, I think flue-cured tobacco farmers are uniquely positioned to be a low-cost producer of this product. And so I have to temper the optimism a little bit because there's going to be some blood on the floor as we try to figure out what happens in the end. And so you have to be very cautious. I think it's wise for farmers to be, if they're a flue-cured tobacco farmer, to probably be trying some of this. Just be very careful that you don't take on more risk than you can handle is the word right here, because it may in a few years emerge as a fairly important crop in North Carolina.
And I think that's very positive, especially coming from an economist on your level, because often folks are looking for that kind of sense of reassurance that maybe it's okay to put one toe in the water, maybe it's okay to try this, and looking at it from the multifacets of what cannabis offers. Some of the folks we've interviewed here, both growers and people that have decided to step into it in rather a large way, seem to be pretty confident. But I hear you saying that kind of look at the numbers and feel the path forward gradually.
I think so, because there are farmers that are doing quite well with it. There are a lot of disaster stories out there where people planted it and didn't have their market tied down, or they were dealing with a processor that didn't have a lot of integrity or went belly up themselves. So you have to be careful. But I do think there's potential here. You just, be sure you don't take on more risk than you can handle.
And I think that's probably the mantra going forward is the volume of risk, i.e. investment that you have to set up, and then looking at the potential, what could be, a marginal or plus side return. And oftentimes, as we've seen with the unpredictables, is what usually catches us.
That's right. That's right. And there's always that risk reward thing. So the more risk you take, you might lose some, but you might do all right too. So just be cautious. Be a good business manager. Be careful who you do business with is really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're coming up on our second break here. So what we want to do is and one of the things I'd like to suggest is maybe we could talk a bit about this whole export world. I know you've done a lot of stuff on the federal level and looking at exports, particularly as it relates to tobacco, but maybe we could talk about it in the sense of how that application and what the countries are that maybe have some better potential, should I say. I know it's back and forth with us, what we see from China, There's always this kind of push and shove, but kind of give us a little clarity when we hear the word export. What does that mean? And just a little insight into some of the intricacies that's involved and some of the kind of dynamics that unless you would tell us, we would never know about. We'll be back in a moment. Stay tuned.
You come out to replace a bad sensor, and that adds a 5-year commitment to my contract, and you don't tell me? Here's your sign.
Switch to the sign that's keeping homes secure and customers happy all over the area. Security from Star Communications. We pride ourselves on fair pricing and quick, friendly service every time.
Somebody trying to break into this place?
Security from Star Communications.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Thank you for being with us. We're coming up on our third segment here, and we're talking with Dr. Blake Brown. Dr. Brown is obviously a very busy person. Background is in economics. He holds a PhD in economics from North Carolina State University, as well as a Master of Science in Agricultural Economics and a Bachelor of Science in Animal Science. He's eminently qualified, nationally recognized, served on the executive committee with the President of the United States, before the President of the United States, in looking at a number of issues related to ag, particularly in that world of tobacco. He's been very aggressive and a leader in that role as we went from what used to be what we call the golden crop here in North Carolina. It kind of moved out of the picture, and we had a lot of changes that's occurred. And one of the things that came with that, Dr. Brown, is that our whole export world kind of started to be exposed to everyone to some extent, like where products are going. And farmers are very, very keenly aware of everything from grain to livestock, poultry, and hogs, and everything else that's part of the export world, and a huge part of our ability to move products and commodities. Help us understand a little bit about the countries that we look at, or maybe some that we don't look at. We hear a lot about China and exports to China. We hear a lot about countries that typically sometimes we do not think about. For example, Mexico, Canada, and other places. That's been a huge news buzz for a while. If you could kind of give us a little, what I was mentioning off air a while ago, maybe kind of a little second tier look at what all that means and how it impacts agriculture. Simply put, if it has a positive impact on agriculture in the world I live in, everything's good. If it doesn't, then everything is not that good. So I'll open that with your observations.
Sure. Yeah, exports are very, very important to almost every segment of agriculture. U.S. farmers produce a lot more product than is needed just here in the United States. And so we are big exporters of almost everything, whether it's pork or chicken or tobacco, turkeys, whatever it is. Cotton, we export a lot of our cotton overseas. And a lot of people don't realize, as you said, we've heard so much about China, and I'll speak to that in a minute because it's very, very important. But a lot of people don't realize that Mexico is one of our biggest trading partners, not just from the fact of us importing things like fresh produce from Mexico, but also exports. Most people would not guess that Mexico was the largest customer for U.S. pork. So the trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, USMCA, that was completed last year, that was very, very important for U.S. agriculture and to facilitate that trade, because we export a lot of pork to Mexico, we export corn to Mexico, but we also buy a lot of fresh produce from them as well. So very important trading partner. Obviously, China is very important, but there are some other big export customers as well. Japan is one of our largest export customers. We send a lot of beef to Japan. We send a lot of pork to Japan. And so a bilateral agreement with Japan has been signed, and that allows us to compete with countries like Australia, which export a lot of beef to Japan, or Denmark, which a lot of people don't realize they export a lot of pork. They have a lot of pigs in Denmark. So these trade agreements will make us competitive with those countries. China has been a huge customer, and Europe. Before I get to China, Europe is also a big customer of ours, and we export a lot of all kinds of agricultural products to Europe, to the European Union. But the one you've heard the most about, of course, is China. And China is very important. They, of course, export products all over the world themselves. We import a huge amount of product from China, but from agricultural standpoint, China is a very, very important customer. They buy a lot of our cotton, which, by the way, also goes to Mexico where it's used. But China imports a lot of cotton. China had been a major importer of soybeans. So when we saw the trade war with China, soybeans were one of the first crops to suffer the most. We export some corn, not as much, but we also export a lot of pork to China. And one of the things that happened that in China that was going to be a really positive factor for us this year is that China lost about half of their swine herd to a virus called African swine fever that they were ill prepared to deal with. It's a big deal because China produced and consumed about half the world's pork. They eat a lot of pork in China. And so when they lost that huge amount of their swine herd, which, by the way, was more than we produce totally in the United States, and we're the second largest producer of swine in the country, just to give you some idea of the magnitude of that. So when they lost that, that means that they need to import a huge amount of meat, pork, poultry. Chinese imports of U.S. pork had just started really increasing despite the tariffs and the trade war. And with the resolution of that trade war being brought about this year, we were set to export even more pork to China and also to get to export poultry to them because they had previously had a ban on imports of U.S. poultry. So it was shaping up to be a pretty good year for the U.S. pork and poultry industry because of the resolution of the trade war and because China needed so much meat to meet to fill the void because they had lost so much of their swine production. Now that's still happening. I looked at Chinese imports of poultry and pork last night when I was looking at some of the data, and the pork exports in particular continue to go up. And so they're probably going to be well over $200 million, but the COVID is really holding that back. And, we talked about in the last segment about how important China was to tobacco and that we hope that comes back. But all of that feeds down. Now, so for soybeans, for example, just the fact that China doesn't have as many hogs now, they lost so many, they don't need as many soybeans. Mm-hmm. So those soybeans needed to be fed to hogs and chickens and beef cattle here in the United States so that we could then export the meat to them. But that whole situation of their loss of swine herd, the trade war, and now COVID has really brought about what could have been a good year, but now it's turning out to be a pretty rough year for us because it trickles down. In North Carolina, for example, corn. We grow a lot of corn now in our crop rotations. Farmers here have been getting 80 cents to $1 per bushel more for their corn than in the Midwest. And that's because we need so much corn here to feed our hogs and poultry. But with the COVID virus coming on, we've seen that really impact these meat markets in terms of getting processing. And so that's actually, sadly, has caused corn prices to decline. The other part of the corn price is the ethanol. With people traveling less, and we've seen what has happened to gas prices and diesel. Well, that also means we don't need as much ethanol to mix with that petroleum. And so that's been another factor to kind of throttle our corn market. So it is all connected, and it's very global in terms of agriculture. Even products like sweet potatoes. We're the largest producer of sweet potatoes in the United States. Over 50% of the sweet potatoes are produced here. And we export, I may get this figure wrong, but I'm thinking 30% of our sweet potatoes are exported mostly to Europe. So it doesn't matter what product you look at that we're growing in North Carolina, the export market is almost always an important part of that. So,
and I think one of the things, Dr. Brown, that we look at, oftentimes we look at it just as simply supply and demand, but in between those two words is a lot of things that you've alluded to here, the processing piece, the production piece, all of those things have to work congruently and to some degree and with as much perfection as possible to make the demand side work and the supply side work, because if one of those pieces fall out, it doesn't matter. Demand can be there. If we can't get it through the process part, if we can't get it through the supply piece to the next step, then the entire train stops. I know that's oversimplification, but I'm trying to get a picture from the way maybe you look at it without putting as much detail in it, I guess.
No, I think that's exactly right. And that's what we're experiencing great difficulty with now. We talked briefly about, just the fact that if workers at one of these processing plants gets COVID, that can shut the whole process down. And that just, we can't get our supply to the consumer, The other part of that is the fact that, about 50% of food was consumed in restaurants in the United States. Now everybody's going to the grocery store to buy that because they can't consume it out of the restaurants. So just repackaging food so that it can go to a grocery store rather than going in bulk to institutional restaurant users is huge. And so that is really causing some issues now. Just how do you quickly change to send it all to grocery stores rather than sending half to restaurants?
Exactly. And I think one of the things that I look at too is just recently in the area, and particularly in Raleigh-Durham area and eastern part of the state, we've seen this huge number of boxes of chickens being carted out of the back of huge 18-wheelers and cars lined up to buy boxes of chicken. And that tells you, or at least it should say to all of us, that there's some problem within that chain of events from supply and demand.
Yeah, and we can talk about that a little more next time, but people have gotten very innovative in trying to figure out how do we take the stuff that was going to restaurants in big bulk packages and then now get it to the consumer. And so, yeah, we saw House of Rayford, I think, was one of the companies that sent tractor trailers to chicken to Raleigh. We've seen restaurants now selling groceries because they have these supplies coming in, and so they can actually repackage them in the restaurant and just sell it as a grocery product. So we've seen some real innovation in terms of trying to get that out, but it's been difficult. And if you're one of these plants packaging for restaurants, how much are you willing to invest to get it to grocery stores? Because maybe this will all change in a year, right? So hard decisions that have to be made. So.
Absolutely. When we come back from our next break, hopefully we can touch on some of those innovations that you're seeing and some more that may be coming up or worked out that we don't see yet. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We'll be back in a moment. We should know it's on the air. Call a friend.
To get the most out of your electronic devices, you need a strong internet connection and a protected home Wi-Fi network. You need high-speed internet from Star. Star has the fastest, most affordable high-speed internet service available for all your devices. We have no long-term contracts or high-pressure sales. Our service speaks for itself, and switching is hassle-free. We take care of everything with free installation from a local company. High-speed internet from Star. Internet at the speed of life.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're coming up on our last segment. We're talking with Dr. Blake Brown. Dr. Brown has been kind enough to sit and talk with us today from his vision and his insight as a highly recognized, and I'll use the word nationally at the very least, economist. And he holds a PhD from North Carolina State University, a Master of Science in Ag Economics, and also a Bachelor's of Science in Animal Science. Well recognized in your field of study, Dr. Brown. You have a lot of expertise. We've talked about a number of issues, any one of which I would say to our audience we could probably drill into and make several segments working with you, but we're trying to, as much as we can, improve the learning curve here. And a couple of things I wanted to touch on this last segment is the whole idea of innovations. This kind of dynamic impact on our economy in this country is also creating innovative ways of doing things. As we went off air, we mentioned moving chickens and chicken product out of the back of trucks. It seems to be a big deal right now, but it just goes to show that, as we mentioned, that shows that there's a problem somewhere. That intervention chain between supply and demand, something's happening, and the companies are getting very innovative how they get it to the people they're trying to supply it to.
That's right. And, just to think about it, I mentioned the previous segment that about 50% of our food was consumed through restaurants or institutional providers prior to COVID. Well, with the shutdown, now most of us are buying all of our food through the grocery store. So if you're a supplier, how in the world do you change from sending packaging product in big bulk packaging for restaurants to now putting it in maybe an 8-ounce packet to go to a grocery store? And so that's been part of the problem. That's why we've seen those innovations, as we talked about, with maybe poultry companies bringing boxes of chickens to the Raleigh area to sell to consumers. And of course, consumers are getting some good buys if they have a freezer and they can put that in it. The other part of that, we've heard on the news about milk having to be poured out by dairies around the country. That is because, for example, most of the milk was used in schools or institutions like that. And then so to try to switch over and get that package to go through grocery stores, just very difficult. One of the little bright spots in all this, it's not a very big part of our ag economy, but has been local agriculture. We hear a lot about local food over the last few years. And so particularly in the area of meats, we've seen demand for local beef or local pork or local chicken supplied by some of these small producers around cities to just go out the roof, because it's harder to get through the grocery stores now. So people are going to these local sources to get some of their meat. But of course, that's not big. It's small, very small relative to our whole North Carolina economy, but it's still a little bit of a bright spot in this thing. So we've heard of restaurants now, they had their supply chain set where food was coming to them to use in the restaurants. Well, they can't sell it in the restaurants. So some of them have gotten innovative and have started repackaging the food that they get that they would have cooked now to sell to consumers. So consumers are able to go to restaurants in some cases and buy meat or buy vegetables or buy other products that the restaurant can't cook themselves. So yeah, we've seen a lot of quick innovation, but it's been fairly difficult. Just the distribution system, trying to cope with the changes has been challenging.
I think part of that too, that in just listening to your observations, a big chunk of that too is the whole labor market, because we've seen not only a disruption in that, particularly as it relates to people that's becoming infected with COVID, but we're also seeing another disruption with people that are well working, and maybe they have what many folks would look at and say they've got a good job, but sometimes there's a catalyst here that they need protection for their face, they need protection, PPEs for their for just doing the job, and now we're hearing some of these major industries folks saying, well, we're going to have a day we're going to lay off, and I'm talking in terms of Amazon and some of the other Target and some of the other larger places that we don't often look at, but it's indicative of how critically important that labor force is.
That's right, and labor is very important on our farms as well. Excuse me. We have a lot of very labor-intensive crops that we grow in North Carolina: tobacco, sweet potatoes, fresh produce. And so those farms are very reliant on bringing labor in to harvest them. For example, blueberries, very labor-intensive crop picking for the fresh market. And we're a big blueberry producing state. So those are important. And we use a lot of what's called H-2A labor. People have probably heard of that. That's a special visa program that allows workers to come in from other countries to spend the season here harvesting or planting or working on farms. And we're very reliant on that. In fact, we used to be the #1 user of H-2A labor in the whole United States. Now we're about 3rd or 4th now. California is using more and more. California, frankly, used to rely a lot on undocumented workers. Now they're having to rely more on these H-2A workers. So these H-2A workers were deemed essential workers, so they were allowed to continue to come across the border, say with Mexico, even after the COVID. But it's been more difficult for new H-2A workers to get through the process to get their visas because some of the embassies have been closed to people coming in. But for the most part, I think North Carolina farmers have been able to get most of their labor. Of course, what they fear is what if you have a worker who gets sick with COVID? Then you may have to quarantine a number of workers, because the social distancing is very difficult to do if you're sitting on a tobacco or a sweet potato transplanter. You can't be 6 feet apart. So farmers are having to be very, very diligent in making sure they do everything they can to protect the health of these workers so that they can stay healthy and work to plant these crops. Because, if we can't plant them, we won't have any to harvest. So.
Exactly. And to that point, some farmers I think it was last year, some crops were literally left in the field because they didn't have access to labor that would go out and actually pick the crops, whether it was tomatoes or whatever it may be. And those crops then, we lose the advantage of having the supply of that product to even get it to the market.
That's right. So maintaining this labor supply is critical. I mean, and we pay good wages for these laborers. They're required to be paid. I think this year it's almost $12 an hour. So it's not only good for our farmers, it's good for those workers who come here and send that money back home. It's a real opportunity for them and a lot of these communities, say in Mexico, rely on that money to come back. So it's, again, kind of like trade. It's involved in all these connections, and it's important for everybody involved. But yeah, we got to get our crops planted so that we can then, even if COVID gets better, we have something to harvest and put back into that supply chain. So
something I want to kind of touch on a bit, I guess, is kind of one of the many takeaways from our conversation today. As you look at it, and we talked a bit about the folks that are in the hog business or chicken business or whatever it may be in that area, is there something that you see that it somewhere down the road may be positive? Are we at that stage that it's time to just be observant, kind of hunker down and hold on, would be a phrase I've often heard. And then when I look at that and I look at it from maybe out the window of an economist, it's what do you say to folks and they've got their livelihood and they're saying, is this going to be long-term, short-term? And the two words that's kind of dire to me to hear is one, of course, is recession. And then the other is just somewhat devastating, is that word depression.
Yeah, and I wouldn't use the word depression, but it'll be very surprising if we're not already in a recession as a result of this. Again, it just goes to back, how quickly can we recover? And I would just say to our farmers, for one thing, they need to pay very close attention to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because we have about $19 billion in assistance coming from USDA to farmers. About $16 billion of that will go to direct payments to farmers. We saw that with trade mitigation, USDA making payments directly to a lot of crop farmers last year, those that were covered by farm programs. This year, we're going to see those payments again to farm program crops like cotton, corn, soybeans. But we're also going to see payments to specialty crops, which would include our fruits and vegetables, hopefully like sweet potatoes. And we're also going to see payments to livestock producers. In particular, cattle are going to get a big part of this. Now, I realize cattle are not a huge part of the Eastern North Carolina economy, but we have some big cattle operations in Eastern North Carolina, some of the biggest in the country, believe it or not. People just don't realize that. And so there's going to be payments to them. USDA will be announcing sometime, I think, within the next couple of weeks of how you apply for these payments. And so farmers need to be aware of that, because that's very helpful. We just probably are through the end of the Paycheck Protection Program, which was for small businesses. Farmers were eligible for that. You can still apply. I doubt if there's much of that money left by now, but we've seen we saw $350 billion in April and $250 billion just released last week. And so that has been a lot of money that's gone into the economy, and it was basically to enable businesses to keep their employees. And if you keep the employees, you don't have to pay the loan back. So it's probably a little late to get in on that program, but pay attention to what USDA is doing and the programs that are available for assistance. We need them this year to get through this tough year.
Dr. Brown, we're coming up on closure of the show. I'll give you last word for about 30 seconds or less.
Well, I think if I were a farmer, I'd be looking really closely at my cash flow sheets. I'd be paying really attention to my financials. I'd be talking with my lenders. I'd be looking to see how I think I'm going to come out this year, how much I'm going to be short, and I'd be looking for this assistance. So it's a year that's going to be a tough year, but it's a year that you're going to have to be very vigilant in terms of managing your business. So hope it'll be better next year.
Absolutely. Thank you for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again next week, and may God bless.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of We Should Know with host J.W. Simmons. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion regarding this or any episode, please send your emails to weshouldknowedu@gmail.com. And remember to tune in every Tuesday at 2:30 for another informative episode of We Should Know.